I do think there is an unbiased opinion to be had here about why the Big 12 really should be, if you're a real college football fan, you're a college football nerd, you're really like you like staying up late to watch what used to be Pac-12 After Dark and is now Big 12 After Dark. You like getting down into the nitty-gritty and appreciating the game for what it is. I truly believe that the Big 12 should be like after your own first choice team that you like to watch, and that you root for. I think the next, I think the next group on your list should be the Big 12. And that's for a few different reasons. And I think the most important one here is that they have true parity across the conference. I know that a lot of people a lot of people talk about this idea that college football is really interesting because of the parity. Anybody can beat anybody and all this. And the second part of that is true. But in the end, college football parity is a little bit of a myth in that you pretty much always see the same programs in the top 25, in the playoff, things like that. You see the same programs in the same general places for the most part. Um, the programs can jump around, they can rise and fall and stuff like that. But for the most part, you see the same groups of teams in the same, in the same part of the top 25 rankings and in the same part of the playoff and bowl season and all that. So there's not as much parity. There's not necessarily all that much parity in college football for a number of reasons. It's money, geography, history, all that. However, if you are a person that appreciates the literally anybody can beat anybody on any given day and it's anybody's ball game, and anybody can win the conference, if you really truly appreciate that, the Big 12 should be your first stop. Last year, going into the final 2 weeks of the season, there was a six-way tie. There was a four-way tie for first place, and then there was two more that if there was two more that were actually in the hunt for a title game berth up until the last week of the season. I mean, almost half the conference was in the race to make the Big 12 championship game going into the last game of the season, which is incredible. You had Colorado, Iowa State, BYU, and Arizona State up there right at the top. Baylor was sitting there right behind them. Texas Tech had a kind of an outside shot, and it came down to the wire. Iowa State, the Iowa State didn't lock up their spot in the Big 12 title game until, midnight of that Saturday, after the Kansas State game got over and all that. We didn't know what was locked up until technically speaking, it wasn't 100% locked up, I believe, until after BYU had beaten their last opponent. So it was kind of a weird thing, but it was so exciting because it was truly anybody's involved in this until the last game of the season. What other conferences can you honestly say that you can get that in? In the Big Ten, every year it is going to be Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon. It'll be those four, and then sprinkle in a fifth or a 16 there. Indiana was good last year, but I don't know how sustainable that is. Michigan State has been good in the past. Washington was playing for a national title a few years ago. It's or was it just 2 years ago now? They might have a fifth or even a 16 that jumps up and has a really nice season, but it'll be those four for the most part. I guess maybe if Iowa can figure their shit out on offense sometime, they could be a one that jumps up a little bit. But you pretty much have that group there. The Illinois could be fine this year, but generally speaking, Illinois, Purdue, Northwestern, those teams are going to be near the bottom. I don't know what anybody knows what to think about USC and UCLA. I would assume UCLA will probably be near the bottom most years. UCLA will probably be middle, mid, top, something like that. But then you go to the SEC. What parity do you have there? It's Bama, Georgia. It's Bama and Georgia. And then it's, Tennessee, Ole Miss, LSU type of thing. It's one of those like five. If you want to throw a sixth one, a rotating sixth team in there, Now it's Texas is in there, or maybe it's Florida or something like that. You know, it's going to be those ones at the top. Mississippi State's not going to rise up. Vanderbilt's obviously not going anywhere. Oklahoma is kind of down right now, and I think they will continue to be down. South Carolina, Kentucky, you have those programs that are just kind of sitting down. They just can't do much. And frankly, I don't know what Florida's future even really looks like that much because they've just lost so much momentum as a program. They're still Florida. They'll probably be fine, but they're not. I don't know if they're necessarily what Florida always used to be. You have on a year in year out basis, you're pretty much picking Georgia to win the conference, and then a couple other teams to challenge for it. In the Big 12, you're looking at this year as far as like legit competitive teams. You're looking at Arizona State can be there. TCU is kind of a dark horse. They've got a really difficult schedule, but they should be a good enough team that maybe if they get some bounces, they can be there. Baylor is probably going to be decent. Iowa State will be there. Kansas State will be there. I would think Iowa State, Kansas State, Arizona State, and BYU will probably be your favorites. Texas Tech has a decent shot at being pretty good. Kansas is kind of who knows. They were terrible to start last season, but then they were white hot the second half of the season to the point where nobody wanted to play Kansas. And who knows what Colorado's going to be now that they've lost two. I mean, they could be great, they could be terrible. Who knows? There's really, Houston's going to be better. I don't know if they're, championship game better, but they're going to be better. The only programs you're looking at in this conference right now that you're looking like they've got a little ways to go before we really think they're competing. UCF's probably going to take a pretty big step back. I'm not really sold on Rich Rod at West Virginia. Cincinnati's still got a ways to go, and you could say Oklahoma State's got a lot of holes they got to fill, a lot of things they got to fix. Is Gundy the right fit there? I don't think anybody thinks he is long term, but how long can you realistically hang on to Gundy and still preserve their status as one of the best frankly one of the best programs in college football over the last 2 decades. That's not a blue blood necessarily. I would argue at least 10 teams are that you can look at and say, okay, they've got a shot. Arizona maybe with the other one. So say 9. Say 9 that you feel are either definitely in it, potentially in it, or we're just not sure, but theoretically the talent and coaching is there to do something. 9 teams that have, an argument to be talked about as even at least dark horse conference title game participants. I think that speaks to a really interesting conference that is going to be close. This is we hear all the time about how we heard it all last year about how the SEC their conference schedule is so difficult. They only play 8 conference games because it's so difficult. And they can't be bothered to actually share an equal schedule with the rest of college football, which is frankly a joke. But they say, well, we beat up on each other too much. I mean, if you look at the Big 12, the teams actually did beat up on each other a lot. You did have 2 teams come out that Iowa State finished the regular season 10-2, and Arizona State I think was 10-2, something like that. Or I think they were 10-2. You had a couple teams that ended up with what appears to be really high end records, but Iowa State won a bunch of close games. Arizona State won a bunch of close games. BYU won a bunch of close games. These teams that even appeared to kind of pull ahead won them all very, very close games. They still beat the hell out of each other all season, and it was a close game. This year, it wouldn't shock me if both of the title game participants had at least 2 losses in conference, maybe 3. There's absolutely a world where one of the title game participants has 3 losses in conference. That's absolutely possible. Because the teams that are expected to compete all have fairly difficult schedules and absolutely 2 or 3 games that they could lose on their schedule. TCU, like I said, has a brutal schedule. Iowa State has a more difficult schedule than last year. You do get your hardest opponents at home, which is which is good. They've got their hardest games are going to be at home. but it's still definitely a more difficult schedule than last year. So it'll be interesting to watch. I think that, just like last season, I would expect this one to come down to the wire, where you're looking at tiebreakers the last couple weeks of the season. You're trying to figure out situations, different, you're running different scenarios and figuring out, what games you need to win, who needs to lose what games, things like that. I think you're gonna have that. You had it last season, you're gonna have it this year. I think you're gonna have it pretty much every year from here on out, especially when you're gonna have more teams that are going to be competitive. Texas Tech has been down for a little while, but gosh, Joey McGuire's put together some really nice teams, and now Texas Tech is like the like the darling of the NIL world because they've got all this oil money that they can dump into everything. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch just on a year in year out basis from a parity standpoint.